Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight's story follows Charles Gioe, a name that rarely appeared in headlines, yet carried weight in rooms most people never knew existed. Charles Gioe was the kind of man who understood that influence didn't always come from being seen. Sometimes it came from knowing exactly when to remain invisible. But let me ask you something. Did you know most people have absolutely no idea where their money disappears every month? Now back to Charles Gioe. Most people don't have a money problem. They have a money tracking problem. That's why I use Kynd Savings. First, expense tracking. It tracks your spending and shows your safe to spend amount. Second, savings goals. Save for bills, travel, or anything important without complicated budgeting. Third, auto checkout. It organizes your daily spending automatically. Fourth, user-friendly. Clean, simple, and easy to use. Search Kynd Savings on the Google Play Store and use code SILENT100 for free access. Link in the description. Now back to Pat Spirito. Night falls over Chicago in the early 1950s, and the city glows with a harsh, electric confidence. Neon signs flicker over gambling rooms and taverns. Elevated trains grind past soot-blackened brick, and in back rooms across the metropolis, men talk in low voices about money, power, and how to keep both. The world has just survived a global war and stepped into the atomic age, yet in certain corners of American life, the law still bends around those who know how to pressure it. Labor unions have become national forces. Hollywood studios produce dreams on an industrial scale, and behind the scenes, secret agreements determine who gets paid, who stays silent, and who disappears. Inside this world, one man's name appears again and again in confidential reports and courtroom transcripts. Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe. He is not as famous as Al Capone, not as publicly notorious as some of his contemporaries, and he prefers it that way. To most Americans, he is invisible, but to film executives, union officials, police intelligence units, and federal investigators, his name means trouble. They associate it with pressure campaigns, quiet threats, and a brand of organized coercion that helped move millions of dollars from legitimate industries into criminal hands. His story is not the tale of a flamboyant celebrity gangster, but of a man who learned to operate in the shadowy space between legitimate business and organized crime, in an era when the lines between those worlds could be dangerously thin. To understand how Charles Gioe became one of the Chicago outfit's reliable specialists in intimidation and racketeering, we have to go back decades, to the crowded immigrant neighborhoods where he was born, and to a city whose rapid growth created both opportunity and deep vulnerability. His life unfolded against a backdrop of mass migration, urban poverty, ethnic prejudice, and dramatic changes in American law, from the experiment of prohibition to the rise of federal power in the mid-20th century. Before his name was associated with Hollywood shakedowns and underworld feuds, he was simply another child in a city struggling to absorb hundreds of thousands of new arrivals, including his own family. Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe entered the world in 1904, at a moment when Chicago was still grappling with the aftershocks of its explosive rise in the late 19th century. His parents were Sicilian immigrants, part of a wave of newcomers from southern Italy who had crossed the Atlantic in search of work and stability. They joined a tight-knit but embattled community clustered in dense urban districts, where Italian dialects mixed with English in crowded tenements, and church festivals were held in the shadow of factories and rail yards. Public records and later law enforcement documents are sparse about the details of Gioe's childhood, but they are clear about his origins. He grew up in an Italian enclave in Chicago, in a world where extended family, village loyalties, and neighborhood reputation mattered as much as any official document. These neighborhoods were places of mutual aid and cultural continuity, but also of hardship. Wages for unskilled labor were low, work was irregular, and industrial accidents and disease were constant threats. Many families packed large numbers of relatives into small apartments, taking in boarders or working multiple jobs just to cover rent and food. Children were often expected to contribute early, running errands, shining shoes, or working in small shops and factories before they were old enough to vote. Education, while technically compulsory for a portion of childhood, was often interrupted or abandoned as economic necessity took over. While there is no complete school record for Charles Gioe, historians of the era note that in communities like his, boys rarely had the luxury of extended schooling. The Italian population of Chicago also faced discrimination that went beyond economic hardship. Newspaper editorials of the period regularly painted Southern Italians and Sicilians as inherently criminal or unassimilable, and popular culture depicted them in caricatures. Employers could easily pass over Italian workers in favor of others, and police sometimes treated entire ethnic districts as suspect. In that climate, the line between community self-protection and involvement in illegal activity could become blurry. Informal neighborhood bosses helped residents navigate city bureaucracy, secure jobs, or resolve disputes, but some of those same men were involved in more clearly criminal enterprises, from illicit gambling to extortion. One form of crime that cast a long shadow over early Italian Chicago was so-called Black Hand extortion. In this pattern, anonymous letters would be sent to small shop owners or wage-earning heads of household, demanding money under threat of vague but frightening consequences. Many of these letters were the work of opportunists. Others came from more organized criminal figures. For immigrants who distrusted or feared the police, or who could not yet communicate easily in English, reporting such threats was not a simple matter. Even families who never experienced such letters directly knew someone who had, and the notion that a man might need friends for protection took hold in many minds. These were the surroundings in which young Charles grew up, a community striving to gain a foothold in American society, yet shadowed by both prejudice from the outside and predatory behavior from a small number within. For ambitious boys in such neighborhoods, there were a few well-worn paths. One led into the factories, warehouses, and rail yards, with the promise of steady work at modest pay and little upward mobility. Another ran through the service economy. Pushcarts, street vending, small businesses opened with borrowed money. A third route, less respectable but often more immediately profitable, led into the world of petty crime and the networks that sustained it. The timing of Gioe's adolescence added another crucial ingredient to this environment: prohibition. In 1919, when he was in his mid-teens, the United States ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. Chicago, a city already familiar with vice districts and political corruption, quickly became a national center for illegal alcohol distribution. The new law did not remove demand. It merely shifted supply into the hands of those willing to break federal statutes and to defend their operations by whatever means they deemed effective. In the years just after Prohibition took effect, loosely organized bootlegging groups evolved into more structured, hierarchical organizations. In Chicago, the network associated with Johnny Torrio and then Al Capone built a kind of underworld corporation, integrating illegal breweries, smuggling routes, saloons, and protection rackets under centralized management. This organization would later be known by many names, among them the Chicago Outfit, but in its early years it was simply the syndicate to those on the street. It drew on a broad base of manpower: drivers, lookouts, messengers, warehouse guards, pickup crews, and men able to collect debts or deliver warnings. Later federal summaries and underworld testimonies would refer to Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe as a longtime member of that Capone organization, suggesting that his involvement with organized crime began in these Prohibition years. How precisely he made his first contacts is not documented in surviving official records, but the pattern for men of his background is well known. Neighborhood ties, shared Sicilian or Italian origins, and family introductions often opened doors. Street corner acquaintances might steer a young man toward work as a driver for a more established figure, or toward employment in a saloon or club that doubled as a front for illicit activities. The boundaries between legal and illegal work could be porous. Hauling crates at night might mean moving anything from clothing to whiskey, and asking questions was not encouraged. By the early 1920s, Chicago law enforcement agencies were already tracking a growing list of young men associated with the Capone syndicate. Intelligence files compiled later in the decade would describe these individuals in brief, clipped phrases: associate, collector, enforcer. In that style of report, Charles Gioe's name begins to appear as one of the many lesser-known figures attached to the outfit's operations. The absence of detailed narrative in those documents reflects the priorities of the time. Police and prosecutors concentrated their energies on higher-profile leaders, while the rank and file were often left in the shadows unless they became involved in a particularly visible incident. What can be said with confidence is that by his mid-20s, Gioe was no longer simply a young man from an Italian neighborhood. He was part of an underworld culture that offered money and influence far beyond what most of his peers could earn in legitimate work. Witnesses and associates who spoke to authorities in later decades described him as a man who understood the power of leverage, of knowing exactly how much pressure to apply to a reluctant business owner, a gambler, or a union official to bring them into line without creating unnecessary public disturbance. He was not a flamboyant street tough seeking notoriety, but someone who learned the value of keeping a low profile while still being recognized, within his world, as effective. The nickname Cherry Nose, which would follow him for the rest of his criminal career, emerged at some point during these early years. Different explanations circulated, some suggesting it referred to a prominent or reddened nose, others attributing it to an injury or to underworld humor. But nicknames in that milieu served a simple function. They made it easier to talk about people without always using their legal names. Police and journalists picked up these aliases and fixed them in the public record, so that even decades later, his underworld moniker is better remembered than any detail of his childhood. While Gioe and others of his generation were finding their footing inside the machinery of organized crime, Chicago, as a whole, was living through the dramatic, often violent consequences of the Prohibition experiment. High-profile conflicts between rival gangs claimed victims on public streets, feeding sensational newspaper coverage that made names like Capone infamous nationwide. Political figures were implicated in protection arrangements. Judges and police officers were accused of taking bribes, and bombings and shootings drew attention to the scale of criminal enterprise in the city. In this loud, chaotic environment, men who operated a step or two removed from the front lines had an advantage. They could profit from the system without attracting the same level of public scrutiny. At the same time, the socioeconomic forces that had shaped Gioe's childhood did not disappear. They simply intersected with the new illegal economy. Immigrant workers still faced exploitation in factories and stockyards, and they also encountered new forms of pressure from criminal organizations seeking to control gambling, loan sharking, or protection within their neighborhoods. For someone like Gioe, who had grown up watching older men navigate both the hostility of the broader society and the demands of internal power brokers, participation in the outfit could appear less like a radical break and more like an extension of familiar dynamics, albeit on a more dangerous and far-reaching scale. Law enforcement efforts to confront Chicago's organized crime networks in the 1920s and early 1930s had mixed success. Federal agents did eventually secure major victories, most famously Al Capone's conviction on tax charges in 1931, but the underlying criminal structures remained. Bootlegging profits had financed the creation of a flexible, diversified syndicate that could pivot into new arenas once alcohol became legal again. Gambling, labor racketeering, and extortion of legitimate businesses all offered new revenue streams. Men like Charles Gioe, already integrated into the outfit's network and experienced in applying pressure without creating excessive public drama, were well positioned to help facilitate this transition. Seen against this broader sweep of history, the early life of Charles Cherry Gioe is less a story of individual transformation and more a case study in how environment, opportunity, and timing can draw a person toward organized crime. Born into an immigrant community navigating poverty and prejudice, he came of age just as Prohibition created unprecedented openings for illegal enterprise. The same city that offered him little in the way of secure, respectable advancement provided, through its underworld, an alternative path built on risk, intimidation, and the careful exploitation of others' fears. By the time the United States entered the Great Depression, Gioe was already embedded in that world. He had learned how to move within its hierarchies, how to take orders from more prominent figures, and how to handle the delicate work of persuading reluctant targets to cooperate. Those skills would, in time, carry his influence far beyond the streets where he had grown up, reaching into union halls and eventually into one of the most visible industries in America, motion pictures. But at their root lay the experiences and circumstances of his early years, a formative period in which Chicago's turbulent growth, the strains of immigrant life, and the opportunities of Prohibition combined to shape the trajectory of a man who preferred to remain out of the spotlight, even as his actions helped define an era of organized crime. As the Great Depression took hold in the early 1930s, the Chicago that had shaped Charles Cherry Gioe changed, but not in ways that loosened the grip of organized crime. Prohibition's end in 1933 closed one enormous source of illicit revenue, yet it did not dismantle the structures that men like Al Capone and his lieutenants had built. Instead, those structures adapted. Bootlegging crews, distribution routes, and networks of corrupt officials were repurposed for new ventures: gambling, extortion, and the manipulation of legitimate industries. In that pivot, Charles Gioe moved from being one of many foot soldiers in a vast illegal alcohol trade to a more clearly defined role as an enforcer and organizer within what was becoming known, quietly but firmly, as the Chicago Outfit. Capone's imprisonment on tax charges in 1930 left a power vacuum at the top of the syndicate, but it did not create chaos for long. Leadership passed to a more committee-like structure dominated by figures such as Frank, the enforcer, Nitti, Paul the waiter, Ricca, and others who preferred to avoid Capone's flamboyance. They aimed for a lower profile and a broader, more stable business portfolio. Contemporary police intelligence memoranda and later congressional testimony depict Charles Gioe during this period as a reliable lieutenant within this second generation of leadership, a man trusted to carry out sensitive tasks and to oversee parts of the outfit's sprawling rackets. Cicero, the working-class suburb just west of Chicago that had served as a Capone stronghold during Prohibition, remained an important base of operations. Its taverns, gambling rooms, and small factories provided both revenue and a canvas for the outfit's methods. Business owners knew that refusing a request for cooperation, whether that meant buying certain supplies, choosing specified distributors, or quietly tolerating gambling devices, could bring unpleasant consequences, not necessarily in the form of spectacular violence, but through harassment, vandalism, or other forms of pressure. Men like Gioe acted as the human interface of this system, visiting establishments, collecting payments, and making sure that the outfit's wishes were understood without the need for public scenes. Police strategies at the time allowed this pattern to persist. Local authorities sometimes launched highly visible raids to reassure the public, but these efforts tended to snag low-level employees or independent gamblers rather than the men coordinating the rackets. Higher-ranking figures, including Gioe, were often named in confidential reports without being directly charged. When they were picked up, it might be on relatively minor allegations, the kind that resulted in brief detentions or fines rather than long prison terms. Even in those limited encounters with the law, their reputations grew. To be identified by detectives as an associate of the outfit was, paradoxically, a mark of status in the underworld hierarchy. The economic catastrophe of the Depression, with unemployment climbing and legitimate prospects shrinking, deepened the pool of people willing to take part in illegal schemes. It also made communities more vulnerable to exploitation. A tavern owner struggling to keep his doors open might find the promise of steady, if illicit, income from slot machines or backroom card games difficult to refuse, especially if refusal seemed likely to bring retaliation. In that climate, the outfit did not need to rely solely on overt threats. It could present itself as a kind of alternative economic system, supplying credit, entertainment, and even a rough version of protection, all at a price. At the same time, major changes in national policy created new areas of potential profit. The New Deal rebalanced the relationship between workers and employers, encouraging unionization and collective bargaining through legislation like the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. For legitimate labor organizers, this was a victory. It meant legal recognition and tools to advocate for better wages and conditions. For organized crime, it signaled opportunity. Unions that controlled vital sectors, trucking, building trades, entertainment, suddenly had leverage they had never enjoyed before. If those unions could be influenced or captured, that leverage could be turned into a source of income. The Chicago outfit was quick to recognize this. Frank Nitti, who emerged as a central strategist after Capone, is frequently described in later government reports as the architect of the outfit's shift into labor racketeering. Rather than merely shaking down individual businesses, Nitti and his lieutenants envisioned controlling entire unions, then using the threat of strikes or slowdowns to extract payments from employers not just in Chicago, but across the country. To implement this strategy, they needed men who understood both intimidation and organization, who could pressure reluctant union officials, install compliant ones, and enforce agreements once they were in place. Charles Gioe fit that profile. By the mid-1930s, law enforcement sources began to associate his name increasingly with labor and business rackets, rather than simply with Prohibition-era bootlegging. His Sicilian background and long-standing ties to the outfit's inner circles gave him credibility within the organization, while his experience dealing directly with small business owners and local figures in Cicero and elsewhere prepared him for the subtler forms of coercion that labor racketeering required. He was not, by all accounts, a charismatic public figure or an orator. His value lay in his ability to communicate the outfit's wishes in a way that left little room for misunderstanding, yet did not automatically generate newspaper headlines. The motion picture industry emerged as an especially attractive target for this new approach. It combined several of the elements that appealed to the outfit: enormous revenues, centralized production, and heavy reliance on specialized labor. Film studios in California depended on projectionists, stagehands, set builders, and other workers, many of them organized under the banner of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, or IATSE. In Chicago, where film distribution hubs and theater networks were already important parts of urban life, the outfit had long interacted with local exhibitors and had developed influence with certain union locals. This existing foothold in the entertainment world made expansion into the national film industry a logical next step. The basic outline of the scheme that developed has been documented in court transcripts, FBI files, and later historical studies. In Chicago, outfit leaders and their allies maneuvered sympathetic figures into key positions within IATSE and related unions. George E. Brown, a union officer with a base in the Midwest, rose to national prominence within IATSE with behind-the-scenes backing from the syndicate. Another figure, William "Willie" Biaffe, a Chicago underworld operative with a history in vice and gambling, became a chief intermediary between the outfit and Hollywood studios. Together, under Chicago's direction, they would use the threat of disruptive labor action to extract large payments from the studios, payments that were then shared with their criminal backers. In this framework, Charles Gioe operated not as a public negotiator, but as part of the Chicago command structure that approved and enforced the overall plan. During the later Hollywood extortion trial in the 1940s, his name appeared alongside those of Paul Ricca, Louis Campagna, and others as a key conspirator. Witnesses and investigators described the conspiracy as a pyramid, with the studios at the bottom, facing demands from union officials on the West Coast, and the Chicago outfit at the top, receiving a portion of the money and ensuring that everyone in the chain did as they were told. Although he was not the face of the scheme in California, that role fell more to intermediaries like Biaffe and, later, Johnny Rosselli. Gioe was one of the men in Chicago whose approval and oversight made the entire arrangement possible. To understand the power dynamics at work, it is important to appreciate the vulnerability of the studios at that time. In the late 1930s, Hollywood was a highly centralized industry, dominated by a handful of major companies that controlled production, distribution, and in many cases, exhibition. Their operations depended on predictable schedules and tight coordination. A sudden work stoppage by projectionists or stagehands, even a short one, could cost enormous sums and disrupt carefully timed release plans. Moreover, the studios were acutely aware of public morality campaigns and did not relish the prospect of labor disputes that might draw political or religious criticism. The threat wielded by corrupt union officials backed by the outfit was effective precisely because it exploited these economic and reputational fears. For Gioe and his associates, the scheme represented a significant elevation from local rackets. Instead of collecting weekly payments from neighborhood taverns or small businesses, they were now positioned to draw revenue from some of the largest entertainment corporations in the world. This did not mean that Gioe suddenly lived a life of glamour in the public eye. On the contrary, one of the outfit's guiding principles during this era was to avoid conspicuous luxury that might provoke official attention. But within his own sphere, his status grew. Reports from federal investigators in the early 1940s, looking back on the preceding decade, routinely describe him as a high-ranking member of the Chicago syndicate, involved in making strategic decisions rather than merely carrying out orders. The Hollywood extortion conspiracy did not arise in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern in which the outfit extended its reach into multiple unions and industries. Trucking companies, restaurant chains, and the construction trades all faced similar pressure tactics, with men like Gioe serving as the connective tissue between criminal leadership and the ostensibly legitimate world of labor relations. The method varied little. First, identify or cultivate union officials who could be influenced. Second, ensure their election or retention in leadership positions. Third, use the resulting power to demand money or favors from employers under the threat of disruption. For many victims, paying was less costly, in the short term, than challenging a system that combined legal labor rights with illegal underworld muscle. Law enforcement responses to these developments were uneven. Local police departments often lacked jurisdiction or resources to tackle complex, multi-state conspiracies. Some officials were compromised by corruption, others were simply outmatched by the sophistication of the schemes. It was only when federal agencies, under pressure from business leaders and reform-minded politicians, began to focus seriously on labor racketeering that the full scope of operations like the Hollywood shakedown became clear. Even then, the outfit's practice of keeping top figures at a remove from day-to-day criminal acts made prosecutions challenging. The case that would eventually bring Charles Gioe into a federal courtroom required years of investigation, the flipping of insiders, and the assembly of documentary evidence tracing money across state lines. During the late 1930s, however, those future courtroom dramas were still in the distance. In the present, the system appeared to be working smoothly for the men in charge. Money flowed from Hollywood to Chicago through various channels, sometimes disguised as legitimate union funds or labor management settlements. Those funds, in turn, helped stabilize the outfit's finances at a moment when traditional bootlegging operations had disappeared and local gambling profits, while substantial, could be unpredictable. For a time, the Hollywood racket functioned as a kind of invisible tax on one of America's most glamorous industries, and the proceeds helped cement the power of the outfit's current leadership. For Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe, this period marked the height of his ascent within organized crime. Born into a struggling immigrant family and shaped by the rough neighborhoods of early 20th century Chicago, he had, by the eve of the Second World War, become one of the insiders in a sophisticated national racket. The trajectory of his life mirrored the evolution of the outfit itself, from street-level involvement in Prohibition-era violence and vice, through adaptation to Depression-era economic realities, to an ambitious exploitation of the new labor landscape created by federal reform. He was not, and never would be, a household name, but in the circles that mattered to him, behind the closed doors of syndicate meetings and in the confidential files of federal agencies, he was now firmly established. Yet the very scale and audacity of the Hollywood scheme contained the seeds of its eventual unraveling. On the West Coast, not everyone in labor or management accepted the arrangement silently. Some union activists resented the influence of distant Chicago gangsters over their contracts and working conditions. Some studio executives, alarmed at the growing demands and wary of their own legal exposure, began to share information quietly with federal authorities. What had once been regarded as an unfortunate but manageable cost of doing business increasingly looked like a criminal conspiracy that could not be ignored indefinitely. As the 1940s began, the United States was edging toward global conflict, and the federal government was expanding its reach in many directions. In that climate, tolerance for large-scale organized crime operations, especially those that crossed state lines and affected major industries, began to shrink. Investigators took a closer look at the flow of money between Hollywood and Chicago, at the relationships between union officials and known underworld figures, and at the quiet but steady rise of men like Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe within the structure of the outfit. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would transform his life from that of a powerful but largely unseen racketeer into that of a convicted federal prisoner, and would expose in open court the inner workings of one of the most notorious labor rackets in American history. In 1940, the quiet arrangements that had allowed the Chicago outfit to siphon money from Hollywood began to unravel far from Illinois. In New York, federal prosecutors and grand juries were probing a range of issues in the motion picture industry: antitrust violations, block booking practices, and, increasingly, the role of labor unions. Independent theater owners complained that powerful unions could shut down their businesses overnight. Studio executives, when pressed, hinted at labor difficulties that had been resolved only through expensive settlements. When investigators pushed harder, a pattern emerged that pointed beyond ordinary labor disputes and toward systematic coercion. The name that surfaced most often in those early inquiries was not Charles Gioe, but that of William "Willie" Biaffe, a Chicago underworld figure who had become a key intermediary for the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. Alongside him stood George E. Brown, the union's international president. Testimony and documents suggested that, starting in the early 1930s, Biaffe and Brown had approached major Hollywood studios with a simple but powerful choice: agree to pay large sums of money in return for labor peace, or face strikes and disruptions that could bring film production and exhibition to a halt. Between them, they collected hundreds of thousands of dollars, eventually more than $1 million, under the guise of labor settlements and union funds. At first, federal authorities treated the matter as a case of union corruption and antitrust abuse centered on those two figures. In 1941, a New York grand jury indicted Biaf and Brown on charges of extortion and using their control of IATSE to restrain interstate trade. Facing strong evidence, they chose to plead guilty rather than risk even harsher penalties at trial. It was at this moment, with long prison terms all but certain, that the focus of the investigation shifted. Government lawyers, recognizing that two key participants were now cornered, offered them a path to reduced sentences if they were willing to reveal who, in Chicago, had backed their activities and shared in the profits. Under that pressure, Biaf and Brown began to talk, in debriefings summarized in later court records and investigative files. They described meetings in Chicago with high-ranking members of the outfit, including men who had risen in the years after Al Capone's imprisonment. Among the names they gave were Paul, the waiter, Ricca, Louis, Little New York, Campagna, and Charles Cherry Nose Gioe. The picture they painted matched what federal intelligence units had already suspected, but could not yet prove. The Hollywood scheme was not an isolated case of a corrupt union local, but part of a deliberate policy by the Chicago syndicate to exploit the bargaining power of labor across an entire national industry. Armed with this insider testimony, federal prosecutors expanded their case. They subpoenaed studio accountants and executives, combed through union ledgers, and traced the flow of money that had left Hollywood under the label of labor settlements and arrived in Chicago as unreported income. They uncovered evidence of regular payments from major studios, MGM, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, RKO, and others, to entities controlled by Biaf and Brown. From there, cash had been withdrawn, converted, or passed on in envelopes to visiting Chicago emissaries. Though much of this chain was intentionally opaque, the combination of documents and insider accounts gave investigators what they needed to argue that the Chicago outfit, including Charles Gioe, had directed and profited from the extortion. By early 1943, the federal government was ready to act. A grand jury in Chicago handed down indictments charging a group of outfit leaders with conspiracy to restrain interstate trade in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and with using their influence over labor unions to extort money from motion picture producers. The list of defendants included Ricca, Campagna, Philip D'Andrea, Ralph Pierce, Johnny Rosselli, and Charles Cherry Nose Gioe, alongside the already convicted Biaf and Brown. Another central figure, Frank, the enforcer Nitti, would not stand trial. Upon learning that he was likely to be named in the case, and fearing a return to prison given his poor health and prior record, he took his own life on a railroad embankment in suburban Chicago in March 1943. His death made national headlines and signaled to the public that the government's new offensive against organized crime was serious. For Gioe, the indictment marked the most dramatic legal crisis of his life. Up to that point, he had attracted the attention of law enforcement but had avoided major federal convictions. Now he faced charges that carried substantial prison time and that placed him, unmistakably, in the inner circle of a nationally important conspiracy. Newspaper articles covering the indictments often featured photographs of Ricca and Campagna, whose names were better known, but they also listed Charles Cherry Nose Gioe among the defendants, introducing him to the broader American public as one of the Chicago figures behind Hollywood's supposed labor settlement payments. While awaiting trial, Gioe and his co-defendants secured legal representation from experienced criminal defense attorneys, some of whom had long histories of representing outfit members. Their strategy was straightforward: challenge the credibility of cooperating witnesses like Bioff and Brown, depict any payments from studios as legitimate union transactions or voluntary contributions, and distance their clients from the mechanics of the extortion. They would argue that the government was overreaching by interpreting ordinary, if aggressive, labor negotiations as part of a criminal conspiracy orchestrated from Chicago. The trial that opened in Chicago federal court in the autumn of 1943 drew intense attention from both the press and the entertainment industry. Hollywood executives, summoned as witnesses, traveled to Illinois to describe under oath the pressures they had faced. Some spoke cautiously, mindful of possible civil liability and of their own reputations, but their accounts generally supported the prosecution's narrative that they had been confronted with the prospect of damaging strikes or boycotts unless they agreed to pay large sums to avert trouble. The fact that those payments had continued over many years, well beyond what might be expected for routine labor peace, reinforced the idea that something more than normal union bargaining was at work. The centerpiece of the government's case was the testimony of Bioff and Brown. On the stand, they provided detailed descriptions of their relationship with the Chicago outfit. They recounted how, after gaining control of IATSE, they had gone to Chicago to seek underworld backing, and how, in return for that support, they had agreed to share the proceeds of their Hollywood shakedown with Rica, Campagna, Gioe, and others. According to their testimony, the Chicago men decided when and how much pressure should be applied to the studios, approved settlements, and received a share of the money, sometimes through couriers, sometimes during meetings in Chicago hotels and offices. When it came to Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe, Bioff portrayed him as one of the key Chicago recipients of the extorted funds, someone whose approval carried weight in decisions about the racket. He did not depict Gioe as the public face of the scheme, but as an important participant in the leadership group that had authorized and benefited from it. Federal agents supplemented this narrative with surveillance reports and prior intelligence describing Gioe as a ranking member of the outfit, already long associated with its operations in Cicero and labor matters. Defense attorneys attacked the motives and character of Bioff and Brown, emphasizing that they were admitted wrongdoers who had cut deals to save themselves from longer prison sentences. They suggested that their clients were being framed by embittered subordinates seeking favor with the government. In cross-examination, they pressed inconsistencies and highlighted the lack of direct documentary evidence linking some of the defendants to specific cash deliveries. For Gioe, they argued that mere association with known criminals and attendance at certain meetings did not prove active participation in a conspiracy. The jury, however, was confronted with a broad pattern backed by numerous witnesses and records, not just the words of two cooperating insiders. They heard about large cash withdrawals made soon after studio payments, about union decisions that seemed to align suspiciously well with the demands of Chicago figures, and about the long-standing relationships between the defendants and individuals like Bioff. They saw that the money extracted from Hollywood had not been used primarily for the benefit of rank-and-file union members, but had instead enriched a small group of men with close ties to organized crime. In November 1943, after deliberations that were closely watched by reporters, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the Chicago defendants, including Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe. The court found that they had conspired to use union power unlawfully to restrain interstate commerce and to extort money from the studios. Sentencing followed quickly. The judge, in remarks reported in newspapers across the country, condemned the defendants for corrupting a legitimate labor movement and undermining public confidence in both unions and business. He emphasized that their actions had gone beyond tough bargaining into the realm of organized coercion. Gioe, Rica, Campagna, D'Andrea Pierce, and several others received sentences of up to 10 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines. Bioff and Brown, having cooperated, received lighter penalties, though still significant. For the first time, a group of top-level Chicago outfit leaders faced long federal terms not for tax evasion or minor offenses, but for a major conspiracy that openly linked organized crime to one of the country's most visible industries. To labor activists who had struggled against corruption within their own ranks, and to reformers who had long warned about underworld infiltration of unions, the case was both a vindication and a sobering reminder of how deeply such influence could penetrate. Appeals followed, as was standard in major cases. Defense lawyers argued that the trial court had erred in admitting certain evidence and in its instructions to the jury, and they renewed their attacks on the credibility of cooperating witnesses. The appellate courts, however, largely upheld the convictions, finding that the evidence presented was sufficient to support the jury's findings and that no reversible errors had occurred. When the Supreme Court declined to take up the case, the legal avenues narrowed. The sentences stood, and the defendants were transferred to federal penitentiaries to begin serving their time. For Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe, the move from the relative freedom of Chicago's underworld to the regimented environment of a federal prison represented a profound shift. Behind bars, his status as an outfit figure meant little in terms of daily routine. He faced the same work assignments, institutional rules, and surveillance as other inmates. Yet even in confinement, his connections mattered. Like other high-profile organized crime figures, he was able to maintain contact with the outside world through letters, visits, and attorneys. Federal reports from the period indicate that, while imprisoned, men like Ricca and Campagna were still regarded by law enforcement as influential voices in outfit affairs, offering guidance that was relayed through trusted intermediaries. On the outside, their incarceration helped accelerate a leadership transition within the Chicago syndicate. Tony Accardo, an outfit veteran who had risen through the ranks during Prohibition and the 1930s, increasingly assumed responsibility for day-to-day operations. Ricca, even while officially behind bars, was widely believed to remain an important advisor, but Accardo's practical control grew. The outfit continued to adapt, focusing more heavily on gambling, local rackets, and eventually new ventures such as early investments in Las Vegas casinos. In that evolving structure, the eventual return of figures like Charles Gioe would pose both opportunities and complications. Life in federal prison during the 1940s was austere but not chaotic in the way popular films sometimes suggested. Violence certainly occurred, but the daily reality for most inmates was a repetitive schedule of roll calls, work details, meals, and regulated recreation. For a man accustomed to wielding influence on Chicago streets and in union back rooms, the loss of autonomy could be particularly jarring. Whatever privileges underworld status might confer did not erase the fact that he was, legally and practically, under the control of the federal government. Still, the sentences handed down in the Hollywood extortion case did not play out as the full decade of confinement they appeared to promise. In the immediate post-war years, as prison populations swelled and political priorities shifted, pressures mounted to review certain long sentences, particularly for older inmates or those deemed to have behaved well. Defense attorneys for the convicted outfit figures filed motions for sentence reductions and pressed parole boards for early release. Supporters submitted letters arguing that their clients had families to support and that they no longer posed a major threat. By the late 1940s, these efforts began to bear fruit. Sentences were quietly reduced and paroles granted, in a series of decisions that would later draw criticism from reformers who believed that organized crime figures were benefiting from undue leniency. Among those who left federal custody earlier than the original 10-year term expired was Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe. Exact dates varied by source, but by the close of the decade he was back on the streets, no longer confined by prison walls but returning to a Chicago that had changed during his absence. He came out with a federal conviction attached permanently to his name, a fact noted in internal law enforcement files, and in occasional press references whenever his activities drew attention. The Hollywood extortion case had made it impossible for him to be regarded as just another shadowy local figure. He was now indelibly associated with one of the most publicized organized crime prosecutions of the era. At the same time, his release coincided with a period in which the federal government, shaken by revelations about underworld power in cities across the country, was beginning to focus more systematically on organized crime, culminating, a few years later, in nationally televised Senate hearings. For Gioe personally, the years immediately after his release presented both familiar opportunities and new risks. The outfit's operations were still robust, and his experience in labor and business rackets made him a valuable asset. Yet the Hollywood case had also created enemies and unsettled relationships, particularly with one man whose cooperation with the government had been essential to the convictions, Willie Biaffe. As law enforcement attention shifted to new fronts and the post-war American economy boomed, old grudges and new calculations would shape the final chapter of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe's life, in a way that underscored the enduring dangers of participation in organized crime, even for those who tried to keep their power in the shadows. When Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe stepped back onto the streets as a free man in the late 1940s, the world he re-entered was both familiar and profoundly changed. Chicago was no longer the rough prohibition city of his youth. War industries had boomed and then wound down. Veterans were coming home with new expectations, and families were moving out toward the bungalows and emerging suburbs that ringed the urban core. Yet beneath this shifting surface, the Chicago outfit remained a durable presence. It had traded some of its flashier violence for a quieter, more methodical control over gambling, unions, and key businesses. Into that streamlined machine, Gioe, now a convicted federal racketeer with a decade-long sentence cut short, had to find his place again. The outfit he returned to was, organizationally, more sophisticated than the one that had ridden high during Prohibition and the early 1930s. Paul the Waiter Ricca, although officially a federal parolee and keeping a low public profile, retained enormous influence. Tony Accardo, a former Capone bodyguard turned strategist, functioned increasingly as the day-to-day boss. Their goal, as many historians and former law enforcement officials later described it, was to make the syndicate look less like a street gang and more like a hidden holding company. Violence had not disappeared, but it was deployed selectively, often out of public view. The real emphasis lay on steady, recurring revenue, gambling operations, loan sharking, and the long-term exploitation of labor and business relationships. In that context, Charles Gioe's resume made him valuable. He had long-standing ties to the old Capone group, credibility with the Ricca-Accardo leadership, and direct experience in labor racketeering at the highest levels, as demonstrated by his role in the Hollywood extortion conspiracy. Internal police and federal memoranda from the late 1940s and early 1950s consistently listed him as a ranking member of the Chicago syndicate. Some described him as associated with Cicero and suburban operations, others as tied to labor and union matters. The precise titles used in those reports, lieutenant, enforcer, labor contact, vary, but the picture is consistent. He was not merely an aging relic but an active participant in the outfit's post-war activities. Reintegrating into that world after years behind bars was not simply a matter of walking back into old haunts. Prison had changed his legal status and his risk profile. He was now on federal parole, subject to supervision and potential violation if he drew overt attention. At the same time, his conviction had made his name more visible to law enforcement in Chicago and Washington. He appeared in indexed, known hoodlum lists compiled by local crime commissions and federal agencies. Any business he frequented was more likely to be quietly noted, any legal trouble more likely to be flagged. Yet the very nature of the outfit's post-war strategy made someone like Gioe useful precisely because he understood how to operate under such conditions. Rackets had to be run with more insulation between the leadership and the front-line activities. Bookmaking was spread through a network of small wire rooms and lay-off bettors. Slot machines and other gambling devices were placed in taverns and social clubs under the nominal control of local distributors, who in turn answered to outfit figures. Unions were influenced not only through obvious corruption, but via behind-the-scenes guidance on who should run for office, which contracts to contest, and which disputes to settle quietly. In such a system, men who could enforce the outfit's interests without generating sensational headlines were prized. The wider city provided ample opportunities. Chicago's economy rebounded quickly in the late 1940s. Working-class neighborhoods filled with people who now had steady paychecks and disposable income, fueling demand for entertainment, legal and otherwise. Illegal betting on horse races and sports thrived, alongside neighborhood dice games and card rooms. Taverns became key sites for both social life and under-the-table gambling. Many of these establishments faced a dual reality: legitimate business on the surface and under pressure, outfit-linked machines or betting operations in the back. Accounts from police raids and later investigative reports suggest that men like Gioe were central in making sure those tavern owners cooperated, whether through persuasion, implied threats, or the simple presentation of no-nonsense terms. Labor remained another major arena. Though the Hollywood extortion operation had been dismantled by federal prosecution, the broader approach it represented, the use of union power as leverage over business, did not vanish. In the Chicago area, unions representing truck drivers, building trades, and service workers all drew intense interest from organized crime. If the outfit could influence who controlled a local, it could shape contract negotiations, decide which firms got jobs, and demand under-the-table payments for guaranteeing labor peace. Confidential reports compiled for the Chicago Crime Commission and federal bodies repeatedly pointed to the outfit's hidden role in such matters, and often placed Gioe's name among those handling or supervising contacts with specific locals. Much of this activity remained beyond the reach of firm legal proof. Employers and honest union officials who suspected underworld involvement had powerful incentives to remain quiet. Challenging an entrenched outfit presence could bring retaliation, economic losses, or isolation within one's own organization. Moreover, the mechanics of labor racketeering were often complicated, involving layers of front men, intermediaries, and seemingly legitimate consulting or labor relations firms. For law enforcement, connecting these layers to individuals like Charles Cherry Nose Gioe in a way that would stand up in court was extremely difficult. At the national level, however, attitudes toward organized crime were shifting. During the 1930s and early 1940s, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had focused more on bank robbers, kidnappers, and wartime security threats than on syndicated crime. But by the late 1940s, as spectacular street crime cases waned and concerns about corruption and racketeering grew, the federal lens began to refocus. The Hollywood case, with its clear linkage of a major national industry to the Chicago outfit, had been an early signal. Post-war investigations into gambling and waterfront rackets on the East Coast, as well as high-profile assassinations of underworld figures in various cities, added to the mounting sense that organized crime was a systemic national problem, rather than a series of local curiosities. This growing concern culminated in the U.S. Senate's Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, popularly known as the Kefauver Committee, after its chair, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Beginning in 1950, the committee held public hearings across the country, including in Chicago, calling witnesses from law enforcement, business, and the underworld. Millions of Americans watched on the relatively new medium of television as gamblers, racketeers, and allegedly corrupt officials were questioned under bright lights. Although Charles Cherry Nose Gioe was not among the star witnesses who became minor celebrities or national embarrassments. Through their televised appearances, his name appeared in staff background reports and crime commission materials that helped shape the committee's understanding of the outfit's structure. Those reports consistently portrayed him as part of the Rica-Accardo orbit, a veteran of the Hollywood conspiracy now active once again in Chicago rackets. He was listed in charts tracing relationships among outfit figures and in discussions of the syndicate's historical penetration of labor unions. Such documents, though not part of the public spectacle, circulated among investigators and policymakers. They helped solidify in official minds a particular image of Gioe, not a flamboyant, independent actor, but a dependable component in a larger machine, capable of handling delicate or forceful assignments as needed. The Kefauver hearings did not dismantle the outfit, but they changed the atmosphere in which it operated. Public awareness of organized crime's reach grew dramatically. Politicians, pressured by constituents who had seen televised evidence of corruption and underworld influence, began pushing for tougher laws and more resources for enforcement. In Chicago, the Crime Commission and reform-minded states' attorneys cited the hearings as validation of their long-standing warnings. Federal agencies, though still limited by jurisdictional boundaries and internal priorities, were under new pressure to demonstrate that they were taking syndicated crime seriously. For someone in Charles Gioe's position, this meant that the margin for error narrowed. Casual meetings in public places, conspicuous displays of wealth, or obvious intimidation could more easily trigger surveillance, raids, or grand jury attention. The outfit responded by further professionalizing its operations. Legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, trucking companies, vending machine distributors, and service firms became increasingly important as both sources of income and plausible covers. When law enforcement scrutinized a man like Gioe, they might see on paper a stake in a vending route, a role in a labor-related company, or an interest in a suburban business. Even as confidential informants and investigators believed those legitimate roles were intertwined with illicit influence. Meanwhile, the post-war migration of Americans to new regions created fresh opportunities and tensions. Organized crime figures from older cities sought to extend their reach into growing markets in the South and West: Las Vegas casinos, Arizona racetracks, California nightlife, and more. Chicago was no exception. Outfit emissaries appeared in Nevada gambling halls and in deals involving Western investments. Men with prior experience in the entertainment and labor fields, such as those who had once overseen the Hollywood shakedown, had knowledge and contacts that could be useful in this expansion, even if they were not the central figures on the ground. Though documentation tying Charles Cherry Nose Gioe directly to specific ventures in Las Vegas or Arizona is limited and often speculative, what is clear from law enforcement summaries is that he remained part of the circle considered qualified for such assignments. He represented a bridge between the older, Prohibition-era outfit and its post-war, multi-state incarnation. His criminal record and reputation could be a liability in court, but within the syndicate, they also served as credentials, proof that he had taken risks, kept confidences, and endured prison without publicly breaking ranks. That internal status did not guarantee security. The outfit, like other large criminal organizations, enforced a ruthless internal discipline. Men who attracted too much unwanted attention, mismanaged assigned territories, or appeared disloyal could find themselves demoted, marginalized, or worse. Post-war years saw a number of unexplained disappearances and murders of underworld figures in Chicago and elsewhere. Some were likely the result of external disputes, conflicts with rival gangs, or victims of independent vendettas. Others, investigators suspected, were internal house cleaning by syndicate leadership seeking to minimize vulnerabilities in an era of heightened scrutiny. At the same time, the legacy of the Hollywood extortion case continued to cast a long, dangerous shadow. Within the outfit, there was deep resentment toward those who had cooperated with authorities. Willie Biaffe, whose detailed testimony had been essential in securing convictions against Ricca, Kynd, Gioe, and others, had served a reduced sentence and then built a new life under an assumed name in Arizona. To many in Chicago, he personified betrayal, a man who had profited from syndicate backing and then, when cornered, had traded secrets for leniency. Law enforcement reports and later historical accounts suggest that bitterness toward Biaffe remained strong well into the 1950s, simmering beneath the outfit's outwardly businesslike facade. Against this backdrop, Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe moved through the last years of his life. Outwardly, he was one of a number of aging but still active outfit figures with records reaching back to the Capone era. He appeared in surveillance logs as a participant in meetings at restaurants, clubs, and offices frequented by known syndicate men. He was occasionally mentioned in press pieces that recapped the Hollywood case or discussed the Chicago mob's history. In confidential assessments, both local and federal, he remained listed among the city's key organized crime figures, though by now younger men, some of whom would become notorious in their own right, were rising beneath Accardo and Ricca. Inwardly, the pressures mounted. He had already once been brought down by a high-profile federal case linked to Hollywood and labor racketeering. Law enforcement was more alert than ever to the connections between unions, business, and organized crime. Internal outfit politics were shifting as leaders sought to adapt to new realities and to protect themselves against informants, ambitious subordinates, and renewed government attention. In that climate, every long-time insider who carried both knowledge of past conspiracies and potential exposure represented, depending on one's perspective, either a trusted veteran or a latent risk. By the early 1950s, the ingredients that had shaped Charles Gioe's entire criminal career, tight-knit associations, a willingness to apply pressure, and a capacity to operate in the gray space between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise, were still present. But now they existed in a harsher light, illuminated not only by investigative reporters and local watchdogs, but by federal agencies and congressional committees that had learned, through cases like the Hollywood extortion trial, how much damage such hidden influence could inflict. It was within this increasingly tense and scrutinized environment that the final events of his life would unfold, events that would remove him permanently from the outfit's ranks and leave yet another unsolved killing in the annals of Chicago's underworld history. In the early 1950s, Chicago's nights still belonged to the same uneasy combination of neon and shadow that had framed Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe's entire adult life. But the mood was different now. The city was richer, more orderly on the surface, the war years having left behind factories, new housing, and steady wages. Yet behind the facades of taverns and storefronts, the same old conversations continued in low tones, about loans and collections, about machines and routes, about who had the right to walk into a business and expect something in return. The outfit had survived Prohibition, the Depression, the Hollywood extortion case, and a world war. It now faced a new test: how to preserve its power in an era when television beamed congressional hearings on organized crime into American living rooms and federal agencies were paying closer attention than ever. For men like Charles Gioe, this meant living in a kind of twilight. He was neither an anonymous street tough nor one of the handful of major bosses whose names had become familiar in the newspapers. Instead, he occupied a middle tier, well known within law enforcement circles, clearly important within the outfit, but not the kind of figure reporters chased for front-page photographs. Surveillance logs, intelligence summaries, and crime commission reports from the period show him appearing regularly in the company of others identified as outfit members, especially in Chicago's western suburbs and in neighborhoods long associated with syndicate influence. He was part of the machinery that kept gambling and labor rackets functioning, even as the leadership above him tried to lower the organization's overall profile. At the same time, the consequences of the Hollywood case still hung heavily over the syndicate. Inside the outfit, there was a stark contrast between the fates of those who had stayed silent and those who had cooperated with authorities. Men like Ricca, Campagna, Dandria, and Gioe had served serious federal time. Their reputations within the underworld had, if anything, been reinforced by the fact that they had endured prison without publicly implicating higher-ups. By contrast, Willie Biaffe and George Brown, whose testimony had made those convictions possible and had secured them reduced sentences, were viewed with deep hostility by their former criminal associates. Biaffe, in particular, became a kind of symbol of betrayal. After his early release from prison in the mid-1940s, he left Chicago and settled in the Southwest, adopting an assumed name and taking work in what appeared to be legitimate enterprises. By the early 1950s, he was living in Arizona, far from the neighborhoods where he had once collected envelopes on behalf of the outfit. There, according to contemporary news accounts and later historical studies, he worked in business ventures tied to the post-war building boom, operating in a world of contracts, equipment, and unions that would not have been entirely unfamiliar to a former labor racketeer. Within the outfit, his very existence in this new life was an irritant and a perceived risk. The syndicate's culture placed enormous value on silence and steadfastness. To talk to the authorities, especially in a way that put leaders in danger of long prison terms, was a fundamental violation of its code. Even after Biaffe had served his abbreviated sentence, his past cooperation left him permanently marked in underworld eyes. Law enforcement agents who tracked the outfit during these years often noted, in their analytical memos, that resentment against him remained intense. They fully expected that at some point the organization would attempt to settle the score. Against that backdrop, the position of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe in the early 1950s was complicated. He was, by all available evidence, back in good standing with the outfit after his release from federal custody. Intelligence reports continued to list him as a significant figure, and there is no indication that he had fallen into open disfavor with Ricca or Ricardo. Yet the Hollywood case had exacted a high personal cost from him. He had carried a long prison term and acquired a permanent federal felony record, while the man whose testimony had been instrumental in that conviction was living under a new name, earning money in far-off Arizona. What Gioe himself felt about this situation cannot be known with certainty. He left no diaries or public statements. But investigators and later historians have pointed out that there were both emotional and practical reasons why Biaffe's post-prison life would have been of interest to him. Emotionally, he was part of a cohort that had paid a heavy price for keeping syndicate secrets. Practically, he was a veteran of labor racketeering at a time when Biaffe, in Arizona, was once again positioned near unionized industries and major construction projects. The overlap between old resentments and new opportunities was hard to ignore. Meanwhile, the outfit was expanding its own reach into the rapidly developing West. Chicago-connected gamblers and investors were involved in emerging Las Vegas casinos and in other ventures that depended on building trades and trucking. Arizona, geographically between Chicago and the Pacific Coast, was increasingly on the underworld's mental map. In such a context, the fact that a former insider and government witness like Biaffe had quietly planted himself in that region attracted attention not only from law enforcement but, by most reasonable accounts, from his former associates. Some contemporary police and journalistic sources later suggested that, in this period, Charles Gioe became involved in monitoring or approaching Biaffe. These accounts vary in detail and certainty. A few claim that Gioe traveled to Arizona, met with Biaffe, and either demanded money from him or warned him to keep away from certain union or business activities. Others are more cautious, noting only that Chicago authorities believed some contact between the two men had occurred, without specifying its nature. The surviving official record is fragmentary. Federal files from the era are heavily redacted, and not all local police notes were preserved. What is clear is that by the early 1950s, some investigators were convinced that tensions between the two former co-conspirators had resurfaced in the Southwest. Within the outfit, such a development would have been delicate. On the one hand, there was long-standing anger at Biaf for his testimony and a strong desire among some members to see him punished. On the other hand, the syndicate was acutely aware, in the wake of the Kefauver hearings and other investigations, that overt retaliation against high-profile government witnesses could bring intense federal pressure. If Biaf, living under another name in Arizona, was keeping a relatively low profile and not actively causing trouble, a decision to move against him would not necessarily have been unanimous. Leaders who prioritize stability and the avoidance of unnecessary scrutiny might have viewed any unilateral attempt to confront or extort him as reckless. This is where some law enforcement analysts later placed Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe. According to certain investigative summaries written after the fact, there was a belief among officials that he may have overstepped internal boundaries in his dealings with Biaf, either by trying to extract money from him on his own initiative, or by conducting those dealings in a way that senior outfit leaders saw as endangering their broader interests. These interpretations are, by necessity, based on inference, informant statements of varying reliability, and the pattern of subsequent events. There is no surviving document in which Rica, Accardo, or any other leader sets out their thinking in plain language. While these undercurrents played out, Gioe's life in Chicago followed a familiar, if careful, pattern. He was no longer a young man. By the early 1950s, he was in his late 40s, part of an older generation of Chicago mobsters who had come up in the Capone years. Yet he remained active. Crime Commission observers placed him regularly in Cicero and other western suburbs, districts that had long served as strongholds for the outfit's gambling and tavern interests. Suburbanization had given these areas new strategic importance. As families moved outward from the city, so did nightlife and the opportunities to place slot machines, jukeboxes, and sports betting operations in a new crop of establishments. Police who looked closely at these districts often found the same pattern repeating itself. A tavern would open and shortly afterward acquire coin-operated devices, pinball machines, jukeboxes, or other equipment from a particular distributor linked in intelligence files to the outfit. Bookmakers would quietly take bets in back rooms that were otherwise used for private parties or storage. On paper, the businesses might be wholly legitimate. In practice, a share of their profits flowed back through routes overseen by men like Gioe. The enforcement of these arrangements was typically low-key, subtle warnings, mention of trouble that compliance could prevent, but everyone involved understood that the pressure was real. Law enforcement interactions with Gioe during these years tended to be brief and inconclusive. He was questioned more than once in connection with gambling raids or investigations into labor matters, but prosecutors rarely had enough admissible evidence to charge him with serious offenses. When he did face minor allegations, he handled them as many outfit figures did, through competent legal representation and an insistence on his own legitimacy. To police interrogators, he could present himself as a businessman with interests in vending or service companies, and as a parolee who understood the consequences of violating federal supervision. Behind that guarded public stance, his name continued to appear in confidential lists and organizational charts assembled by federal agents and crime commissions. He was almost always linked to labor, to Cicero, and to the subset of outfit leaders who had once controlled the Hollywood extortion racket. Analysts noted that, even as younger men rose to prominence, the old Hollywood crew still wielded influence and retained deep knowledge of how to use unions as levers against business. In that sense, Charles Cherry Nose Gioe remained part of a dangerous institutional memory. By mid-decade, the convergence of several trends, the outfit's caution in the face of national scrutiny, ongoing resentment toward former witnesses like Biaf, and internal anxieties about loose ends from earlier rackets created a volatile atmosphere. Law enforcement officials who specialized in organized crime sensed that something was likely to give. They watched travel patterns, scrutinized Western business deals, and took careful note of any sign that long-standing resentments might be turning into action. In the summer of 1954, the tension became visible in the most definitive way possible, through an unexplained killing. In mid-August of that year, Charles Cherry Nose Gioe was found dead in the Chicago area, shot in what investigators immediately recognized as a professional-style attack. He had been in or near his car when he was killed. There were no reports of a struggle, no immediate witnesses willing to come forward, and no sign that robbery had been the motive. Detectives on the scene, familiar with his background and reputation, instantly suspected that this was an organized hit. The location, on the outskirts of the city, away from downtown's crowded streets, fit a pattern seen in other organized crime killings of the period. So did the timing and the method. A sudden, decisive act against a man who had known enemies and who lived in a world where deadly disputes were sometimes resolved without warning. Local newspapers carried the basic facts in short articles, identifying him by name and nickname, noting his history in the Hollywood extortion case, and pointing out that he was considered a key Chicago underworld figure. Federal agents took notice as well, aware that the removal of someone with his experience and connections was not a random event. From the outset, speculation focused on two broad possibilities. One held that Gioe had been killed because of his handling of business or labor rackets in the Chicago area, perhaps for skimming profits, defying orders, or losing control of an important territory. The other centered on his supposed dealings with Willie Biaf in Arizona and the unresolved anger over the Hollywood extortion case. In that view, his death was tied not simply to local disputes, but to a broader attempt by the outfit's leadership to manage old grudges and perceived threats in a way that balanced vengeance with self-protection. Investigators could not, in the immediate aftermath, say with confidence which theory was closer to the truth. What they did know was that a man who had spent decades as a trusted, if not widely famous, figure within one of America's most powerful criminal organizations had been eliminated in a fashion that bore all the hallmarks of an inside job. There was no credible evidence of outside gang rivalry. No independent operator had a clear reason to target him in that way. The working assumption, among detectives and federal agents alike, was that the order had come from within the outfit itself. As officers began the slow, often frustrating work of reconstructing his final days, who he had met with, what calls he had received, whether he had recently traveled out of state, their efforts unfolded under the shadow of his long, complex history. Every line of inquiry led back, in one way or another, to the forces that had shaped his life. The early years in Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods, the rise through Prohibition-era bootlegging, the Hollywood extortion scheme, the years in federal prison, and the uneasy post-war period when old loyalties and new pressures collided. His death, like his career, would prove to be a window into the inner workings and internal tensions of the Chicago outfit at mid-century, a window that law enforcement could peer through, but never fully open. In the weeks after Charles Cherry Nose Gioe was found shot dead near his car on the edge of metropolitan Chicago in August 1954, the official investigation followed a grimly familiar pattern. Detectives canvassed the area, took photographs, traced the registration of the vehicle, and questioned anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. The scene itself offered few clues. There were no signs of a robbery gone wrong, no witness who claimed to have heard a loud argument, no indication that the victim had tried to flee. Everything about the killing suggested planning and control, a chosen place, a chosen time, and a man who, based on long experience, would have known better than to resist once he realized he had been targeted. Within hours, local police knew exactly who they were dealing with. Identification papers, combined with their own intelligence files, confirmed that the victim was Charles Gioe, 50 years old, a man with a well-documented past in organized crime and a federal conviction for his role in the Hollywood extortion conspiracy. The tone of the investigation shifted accordingly. This was not an anonymous homicide likely to be solved through neighborhood gossip or domestic violence leads. It was a gangland slaying, as headlines would soon call it, part of a pattern of organized, carefully executed killings that had been punctuating Chicago's criminal history for decades. Reporters quickly picked up the story. Short articles in Chicago papers sketched his background. Born into an Italian immigrant family, long associated with the old Capone mob and later the Ricardo leadership, convicted in 1943 for helping extort large sums from Hollywood studios through control of a powerful labor union. Some accounts mentioned his nickname and described him as a labor racketeer. Others simply called him a Chicago underworld figure. The combination of his notoriety and the circumstances of his death invited speculation, and journalists did not hesitate to frame the killing as almost certainly an underworld execution. For detectives, the central question was not whether the murder was connected to organized crime, that seemed obvious, but why and on whose orders. They began by reconstructing his final movements. Colleagues and associates were interviewed, at least formally. Family members were questioned about any recent threats or worries he might have mentioned. Officers checked hotel registers, airline passenger lists, and telephone records to determine whether he had recently traveled out of state or met with anyone known to be a rival. None of this produced an immediate breakthrough. Those who moved in his orbit were practiced at saying as little as possible to the police, and whatever private theories they may have exchanged among themselves, they did not share them with investigators. The Cook County coroner held an inquest, as was routine in suspicious deaths. The findings were straightforward. Charles Gioe had died from gunshot wounds inflicted by unknown assailants. The coroner's jury returned an open verdict, listing the manner of death as homicide but naming no perpetrator. Without witnesses or direct physical evidence pointing to a specific individual, prosecutors had little to work with. As in so many previous Chicago mob killings, the most they could do was formally confirm that a crime had occurred and record its basic features for the public record. What distinguished this case from many other unsolved murders, however, was the degree of federal interest it attracted. The FBI, which in earlier decades had often treated organized crime as primarily a local problem, now had a thick file on Charles Gioe. His role in the Hollywood extortion case had brought him squarely into the Bureau's sights, and agents had kept tabs on him after his early release from prison. Under federal law at the time, homicide per se was generally a state matter, but that did not stop the Bureau from opening an investigative file, collecting local police reports, and analyzing potential linkages to interstate racketeering or witness intimidation. Bureau analysts brought to the case a broader perspective than local detectives could easily maintain. To them, Gioe was not just a Chicago figure. He was part of a network that had once used a national labor union to extract money from California film studios, that maintained connections to gambling operations in multiple states, and that had a demonstrated willingness to retaliate against perceived traitors. His murder could not be dismissed as a purely local dispute over tavern machines or bookmaking routes. It had to be evaluated in the context of his past involvement in one of the most prominent organized crime prosecutions of the 1940s. Within that context, one name stood out: Willie Biaffe, Inside the Bureau's files, and in the memories of agents who had worked the Hollywood case, Biaf was inseparable from the story of how the Chicago outfit had infiltrated the film industry's labor relations. He had been the point man, the one who negotiated with studio heads and carried cash back to Chicago. He had also been the man who, facing long prison time, had decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors. His testimony had helped send Ricca, Campagna, and Gioe to prison. After serving a reduced sentence, he had left the Midwest, adopted a new identity, and settled in Arizona. By the early 1950s, federal agents knew roughly where he was and what he was doing, even if they did not monitor his daily activities. Reports described him working under an assumed name in industries tied to construction and unions, territory that overlapped in suggestive ways with his former racketeering specialties. From the outfit's standpoint, he was a walking reminder of betrayal, living a comparatively free and prosperous life, while some of those he had accused were serving, or had recently finished serving, prison terms. Law enforcement observers had long predicted that there would eventually be an attempt on his life. In the wake of Gioe's murder, those observers began to ask a pointed question. Had this killing, in some way, grown out of unresolved tensions between Chicago and its former Hollywood emissary in Arizona? Certain pieces of information seemed to point in that direction. There were rumors, drawn from informants of varying reliability, that Gioe had, in the months or years before his death, traveled to the Southwest. A handful of press accounts and later interviews with law enforcement officials would claim that he had attempted to contact or pressure Biaf, perhaps to demand money or to warn him away from specific union or business matters. The details of these alleged encounters are murky, and historians have been cautious in handling them. No surviving official document lays out a precise sequence of meetings between the two men. What does appear in FBI analytical memos and some Chicago police reports is the belief, held by certain investigators at the time, that Gioe's activities in relation to Biaf, whatever their exact nature, may have displeased higher-ups in the outfit. One line of speculation suggested that he had tried to extract money from the former witness on his own initiative, thus potentially enriching himself while also stirring up attention around a figure the syndicate preferred to leave quietly in the background. Another theory proposed that he had been sent to investigate or approach Biaf officially, but that something about his conduct, perhaps his handling of information, perhaps his manner of making demands, had alarmed Ricca or Ricardo. None of these theories could be conclusively proved, and responsible investigators generally presented them as working hypotheses rather than established fact. Still, they helped shape the way both law enforcement and later chroniclers understood the killing. In that reading, Gioe's death was not simply the result of a local argument. It was part of a longer arc that began with the Hollywood extortion scheme, passed through the 1943 trial and the prison years, and continued into the post-war period of migration and expansion, when former conspirators like Biaf surfaced in new places and in new roles. While these debates played out within investigative circles, the broader public absorbed the news of his death quickly and for the most part without shock. By 1954, Chicagoans had lived through decades in which names like Machine Gun Jack McGurn, Diamond Joe Esposito, and other colorful nicknames had appeared in headlines, only to be followed, sooner or later, by accounts of their violent ends. Charles Cherry Nose Gioe, though less of a household name, fit a recognizable pattern. Editorials in some papers used his killing as a springboard to call for tougher action against organized crime. Others treated it as another reminder that those who lived by such methods often died the same way. Inside the outfit, his passing created a vacancy but not a crisis. There were always other men ready to step into lucrative niches in gambling, labor influence, or suburban operations. His death, like that of other mid-level or upper mid-level figures, underscored an internal reality. Loyalty and long service offered no guarantee of safety if one's actions were perceived as threatening the interests or stability of the organization. To younger aspirants, it sent a message about the limits of autonomy. To leaders like Ricca and Accardo, it represented both a risk managed, if, in fact, they had ordered it, and a reminder that each such act attracted exactly the sort of attention they were trying to avoid. A little over a year later, on November 4, 1955, an event in Arizona seemed to confirm one half of the investigators' suspicions, even as it raised new questions. On that day, in a Phoenix suburb, a car exploded in the driveway of a man known locally under an assumed name. The blast killed him almost instantly. It did not take long for authorities to discover that the victim was in fact Willie Biaffe, the former Hollywood go-between whose testimony had been so central in the 1943 Chicago trial. His body was identified, and the revelation that a protected witness from one of the most publicized organized crime cases of the previous decade had now been murdered in such a dramatic fashion made national news. Press accounts quickly drew the connection to Chicago. Reporters reminded their readers that Biaffe had once represented the Chicago outfit in dealings with Hollywood, and that his decision to cooperate with the government had contributed to the imprisonment of several top syndicate figures. Analysts and commentators described his death as long-delayed revenge, a settled debt in the underworld's particular moral calculus. Law enforcement agencies, both federal and local, shared that view, at least privately. While official statements were cautious, internal memoranda left little doubt that investigators believed the car bombing had been ordered by outfit leaders or their close associates. The coincidence of timing between Gioe's 1954 murder and Biaffe's 1955 death in Arizona deepened suspicions that the two killings were part of the same story, even if the details remained obscure. Some agents theorized that Gioe, in seeking either personal compensation from Biaffe or attempting, perhaps clumsily, to reassert Chicago's authority over him, had triggered internal alarm. In that interpretation, the outfit's leadership may have concluded that the situation was spiraling in an unhelpful direction. An aging but still active Chicago racketeer traveling to confront a former witness in a distant state could draw precisely the interstate scrutiny they wanted to avoid. Eliminating both men, first the potentially uncontrollable intermediary, then the original betrayer, might have seemed, from a cold strategic vantage point, the surest way to close the book on the Hollywood affair. Again, these reconstructions rest on incomplete information, and no court ever established such a chain of events as fact. No one was convicted for either killing. Yet the pattern they suggest aligns with what is known more generally about the outfit's methods and priorities in that era. It was an organization that kept long memories, that balanced the desire for retribution with the need to minimize ongoing exposure, and that sometimes responded to complex situations with stark, irreversible decisions. In official Washington, the deaths of both Charles Cherry Nose, Gioe and Willie Biaffe did not go unnoticed. Congressional committees examining organized crime and labor corruption in the mid-1950s, building on the work begun under Senator Kefauver, cited the Hollywood extortion case as a key example of the dangers posed by the infiltration of unions by underworld interests. Staff reports noted that one of the Chicago conspirators, Gioe, had been murdered in 1954, and that the primary government witness against him, Biaffe, had been killed the following year. These facts were presented not as isolated curiosities, but as evidence of the enduring capacity of criminal syndicates to reach across state lines and to silence, in one way or another, those who knew too much about their operations. Within labor circles, the story of the Hollywood racket and its bloody aftermath became a cautionary tale. Honest union leaders pointed to it as a stark illustration of what happened when members allowed outsiders, however persuasive or seemingly powerful, to dictate the organization's course. Reformers within IATSC and other unions worked to distance themselves from the era of Brown and Biaffe, implementing internal controls and democratic procedures designed to make such a takeover harder in the future. They understood that public confidence in unions had been shaken by the revelations of the 1940s and early 1950s, and that the association of names like Gioe and Biaf with union leadership had done real damage. In Chicago law enforcement memory, the killing of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe joined a long list of unsolved underworld homicides that marked turning points in the city's criminal landscape. Detectives and prosecutors who had pursued cases involving the outfit in the 1960s and 1970s would occasionally refer back to him as one of the old guard figures whose careers spanned the transformation of the Capone mob into a modern crime syndicate. His life and death, when they were discussed at all, were usually framed in terms of lessons learned, about the difficulty of protecting witnesses, about the challenges of prosecuting labor racketeering, and about the ways in which internal enforcement within criminal organizations could frustrate and, paradoxically, assist law enforcement. For historians and students of organized crime, the arc of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe's story offers a kind of anatomy of a particular American underworld career. He began as a child in an immigrant neighborhood marked by poverty and limited opportunity, came of age during the upheaval of Prohibition, and found a place within a criminal structure that promised power and income beyond anything most of his peers could expect in legitimate work. He rose from local enforcement in places like Cicero to participation in a national labor extortion scheme that targeted one of the country's most glamorous industries. He paid the price in federal prison time, emerged into a post-war world in which his old skills were still valued but also increasingly dangerous, and finally died by the same methods his organization had often used on others. Yet his story is not merely a tale of individual ambition and downfall. It is inseparable from larger changes in American life: the growth of cities, the rise of mass entertainment, the development of federal labor law, and the gradual recognition by the national government that organized crime was not just a local nuisance but a systemic threat. The investigation into his murder, however incomplete its results, forced police and federal agents to confront again the realities of an organization that could both infiltrate unions and remove, almost without a trace, those it deemed liabilities. By the time the 1950s drew to a close, new names had replaced his in the headlines. Other trials, other killings, and other scandals captured public attention. But in the background, in the case files of retired detectives, and in the institutional memory of agencies that had pursued the outfit, the name, Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe, remained a shorthand for a particular kind of underworld figure. Not the flamboyant public villain, but the enduring mid-level operative who helped criminal syndicates turn legal structures, like labor unions, into instruments of covert power, and who eventually became a victim of the same merciless calculations that had once defined his own work. In the years after Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe's murder and Willie Biaf's car bomb death in Arizona, the outward shape of American life changed rapidly. The interstate highways spread, suburbs multiplied, television sets flickered in living rooms from coast to coast. But beneath that veneer of post-war normalcy, the structures that had enabled men like Gioe to operate, criminal syndicates, compromised unions, and businesses willing to pay quietly to avoid trouble, remained in place. The difference was that the rest of the country was finally beginning to see them more clearly. One key turning point came not in Chicago, but on a quiet road near Appalachian, New York, in November 1957. State troopers, acting on a tip, raided a gathering of dozens of high-level underworld figures from across the country. The meeting broke up in chaos, with gangsters fleeing through the woods in business suits, but the impact was lasting. The Appalachian meeting, as it became known, forced J. Edgar Hoover's FBI to acknowledge publicly what had been obvious to many local law enforcement officers. Organized crime in America was not just a collection of local thugs, but an interconnected national phenomenon. In retrospect, Appalachian cast a harsh light back on earlier cases like the Hollywood extortion racket. What had seemed in the 1940s to some observers like an isolated scandal, a corrupt union, and a handful of gangsters muscling in on glamorous studios, now looked like a textbook example of how these national criminal networks functioned. Chicago could send one of its own, a man like Biaf, to the West Coast, and with the backing of senior figures including Gioe, turn the bargaining power of a union into a revenue stream flowing across the continent. The underworld did not respect state lines. Neither, increasingly, could law enforcement. The Senate's interest in organized crime, first dramatized in the Kefauver Committee hearings of 1950-51, was revived toward the end of the decade with an even more focused target: the corrupting of labor unions. Under Senator John L. McClellan of Arkansas, the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field, often called the McClellan Committee, began hearings in 1957 that would stretch into 1960. Robert F. Kennedy, then a young lawyer, served as the committee's chief counsel. Their primary spotlight fell on the Teamsters Union and on figures like Jimmy Hoffa, but the memory of the Hollywood extortion case hovered in the background. Committee staff, combing through past cases to understand how gangsters had exploited unions, studied the record of the IATSE scandal. They saw in the careers of Brown, Biaf, Ricca, Campagna, and Gioe a clear pattern: outsiders leveraging muscle and intimidation to gain control of a union, then using that control to threaten strikes and disruptions in order to secure payoffs from employers. The case showed, in condensed form, nearly every danger the committee now warned about on a larger scale: how rank and file members could lose their voice, how honest officials could be sidelined or worse, and how industries could be quietly taxed by criminal actors hiding behind the language of collective bargaining. The public, hearing day after day of testimony about improper activities in labor and management, absorbed this pattern. Though the names in the headlines were different, Teamsters officials instead of Hollywood intermediaries, trucking routes instead of film distribution, the basic story was recognizable. Unions that should have been representing workers' interests were, in some places, being steered or hijacked by men answerable to criminal organizations. The details of Gioe's role in the 1930s and 1940s did not figure prominently in the televised drama, but his case was part of the evidentiary foundation on which lawmakers now stood. The legislative response was the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959, better known as the Landrum-Griffin Act. Building on earlier measures like the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, Landrum-Griffin aimed to make it harder for corrupt leaders and outside influences to dominate unions. It established a Bill of Rights for union members, required regular, secret ballot elections for union officers, mandated detailed financial reporting by unions and their officers, and created criminal penalties for embezzling union funds. In congressional debates, supporters pointed to cases like IATSE under Brown and Biaf as stark warnings of what could happen without stronger safeguards. In Hollywood, the shock of the 1940s scandal had already prompted its own reforms. The studios, chastened by the revelation that they had paid large sums to gang-backed union officials, became more cautious in their labor dealings. Within IATSE, new leadership distanced itself from the disgraced Brown era and strengthened internal controls, aligning more closely with the mainstream labor movement. While no set of rules could make infiltration impossible, the combination of union-driven reforms and federal law made a wholesale takeover of the sort that had enriched Ricca, Campagna, and Gioe far less likely. At the same time, the film industry itself was changing. The old studio system, in which a few major companies controlled production, distribution, and theater chains, was breaking apart under pressure from antitrust rulings and the rise of television. Independent producers gained more importance, and the centers of power within Hollywood became more diffuse. For organized crime, this fragmentation made the kind of centralized, high-yield extortion scheme that Gioe had helped direct in the 1930s more difficult to replicate. There were still opportunities in nightclub circuits, in projectionist locals, in distribution businesses. But the era when a handful of men in Chicago could impose a de facto tax on virtually every major Hollywood studio was over. For the FBI and other federal agencies, the late 1950s and 1960s were a period of belated but determined adaptation. Hoover, publicly chastened by the embarrassment of Appalachian, authorized what became known as the Top Hoodlum Program in 1959. Field offices across the country were instructed to identify and keep detailed files on the most significant organized crime figures in their jurisdictions. In Chicago, that meant compiling and updating information on men like Tony Accardo, Sam Giancana, the Ricca Circle, and in historical files on those who had recently been removed by death, such as Charles Cherry Nose Gioe. These dossiers, while not court evidence in themselves, helped agents trace patterns of association, travel, and business ownership. They also served as institutional memory. When younger agents in the 1960s and 1970s studied their predecessors' work, they saw Gioe's name recur in contexts that taught them how the outfit had evolved. Prohibition, Cicero gambling, labor racketeering, Hollywood, the post-war suburbs, and finally the violent internal reckoning of the mid-1950s. He appeared as an example of an archetype the Bureau was now determined to disrupt. The experienced middle-tier organizer who could translate high-level decisions into day-to-day pressure on tavern owners, union officials, and businessmen. Meanwhile, the Chicago outfit itself entered a new, more diversified phase. Under Accardo's watchful supervision, and for a time, Sam Giancana's more flamboyant leadership, it invested heavily in Las Vegas casinos and in ventures tied to the booming post-war economy. Later investigations and books would detail how outfit money flowed through front men into Nevada resorts, how skimming operations siphoned cash back to the Midwest, and how labor unions like the Teamsters, Central States Pension Fund, were used to finance casino construction. In these arrangements, the basic principle that had underpinned the Hollywood operation, a criminal organization using union power and influence to gain leverage over major industries, remained central even as the specific tactics changed. It is no coincidence that many of the legal tools eventually developed to confront such schemes bore the imprint of lessons learned from earlier cases involving men like Gioe. The difficulty of prosecuting high-level conspirators in the Hollywood extortion racket, and the challenge of protecting witnesses like Biaf from later retaliation, underscored gaps in federal law. Over time, those gaps were addressed. The Organized Crime Control Act of 1970, which included the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO, statute, and formalized the Witness Security Program, commonly known as witness protection, was designed precisely to reach the command structures of syndicates and to shield key cooperating witnesses. RICO allowed prosecutors to argue that a series of related criminal acts, extortion, bribery, illegal gambling, and so forth, could be treated as part of an overarching pattern of racketeering activity conducted by an enterprise. Under that theory, leaders who did not personally carry out every act could still be held responsible if they directed, benefited from, or knowingly participated in the criminal pattern. Looking back from that vantage point, it is easy to see how the Hollywood case would have been framed differently had such a statute existed in the 1930s and 1940s. Instead of relying so heavily on the testimony of Brown and Biaf, and charging the Chicago men under antitrust and extortion laws, prosecutors could have presented the outfit itself as an enterprise whose business model included using unions to extort interstate industries, naming RICA, Gioe, and others as its responsible leaders. Similarly, the witness security program grew in part from the recognition that individuals who testified against powerful criminal organizations were at extraordinary risk. The fate of Biaf, killed by a car bomb nearly a decade after his cooperation, was a stark example. While the specifics of his protection arrangements in the 1940s are complex, and responsibility for his later security cannot be assigned to a single agency, his death nonetheless reinforced a message that echoed through law enforcement circles. If the government expected insiders to break the underworld's code of silence, it had to offer them more than a reduced sentence. It had to offer a plausible chance at a new life. In academic and journalistic circles, the story of Charles Gioe began to attract attention mainly as part of broader studies of the Chicago outfit and of organized crime's infiltration of labor. Unlike Al Capone or, later, Sam Giancana, he never became a central character in popular culture. There were no films built around his persona, no television dramas that turned him into a heavily fictionalized anti-hero. Instead, his name surfaces in footnotes and chapters of non-fiction works, in histories of the outfit, in analyses of Hollywood's labor relations, in accounts of union reform. This relative obscurity has, in a way, made it easier for historians to treat him as a representative figure rather than as a mythologized celebrity. They pieced together his life from court transcripts of the 1943 trial, from FBI memoranda, from Chicago Crime Commission reports, and from scattered newspaper items. These sources rarely reveal his inner thoughts. They show him instead as he appeared to institutions, as defendant, associate, syndicate member, victim. But taken together, they allow researchers to trace the arc of his career and to see how it intersected with larger institutional developments. One recurring theme in such studies is the interplay between individual agency and structural opportunity. Charles Gioe did not invent the conditions that existed in early 20th century Chicago, the poverty of immigrant neighborhoods, the explosive growth of illegal markets under prohibition, the vulnerabilities within rapidly expanding unions and industries. Those conditions would have produced some form of organized criminal activity regardless. Yet the choices he made, to align himself with the Capone mob, to participate in the Hollywood extortion scheme, to continue in racketeering after prison, were his own. He became both a product and a shaper of his environment. Another theme is the cost that organized crime's use of unions imposed on ordinary people. In the Hollywood case, the obvious victims were the studios, which paid out large sums under threat of disruption. But workers, too, suffered when their union leadership was compromised. Money that might have supported strike funds, legal defense, or member benefits instead went into the pockets of men like Brown, Biaf, Ricca, Campagna, and Gioe. Decisions about contracts and working conditions were made not on the basis of members' needs, but on what would maximize criminal profit. Even after the conspiracy was exposed, the resulting scandal cast a cloud over unionism in general, feeding narratives that painted all labor organizations as inherently corrupt, something reformers within the movement had to work hard to counteract. The same dynamic played out, with regional variations, in the later decades when the outfit and other syndicates exerted influence over trucking, construction, and other sectors. From this perspective, the significance of Charles Gioe lies not just in his personal rise and fall, but in what his career reveals about the fragile boundary between legitimate collective bargaining and criminal exploitation. His life illustrates how easily that boundary can be crossed when oversight is weak, when workers are disenfranchised within their own unions, and when employers find it simpler to buy short-term labor peace than to confront the root causes of corruption. At the community level, the neighborhoods that had once been Gioe's base, Chicago's Italian enclaves, the industrial suburbs like Cicero, underwent their own transformations in the decades after his death. Immigration patterns shifted, with new groups arriving from Latin America, Asia, and other parts of Europe. Many Italian-American families moved upward economically, into professions and businesses far removed from the hardships of the early 1900s. Within those communities, attitudes toward the old underworld figures were complex. Some older residents might speak of them with a kind of fatalistic familiarity, recalling incidents of intimidation or favors granted. Others rejected any notion of romance outright, emphasizing instead the damage such men had done to their neighborhoods' reputations and to the prospects of law-abiding residents. Scholars of ethnicity and crime have been careful to draw distinctions here. They note that while a small number of Sicilian and Italian immigrants in cities like Chicago did turn to organized crime, the vast majority did not. Men like Gioe were not inevitable products of their culture. They were specific individuals responding to specific circumstances. Nonetheless, the prejudice that equated Italian with gangster in the early 20th century was real and harmful, and the high visibility of figures like Capone, and, on a more specialized stage, of Ricca, Campagna, and Gioe, made it harder for ordinary Italian-American workers and business owners to be seen on their own terms. In that sense, the process by which unions cleaned house, industries reformed, and law enforcement developed more sophisticated tools did more than just curb the power of men like Gioe. It also helped, indirectly, to separate the image of honest working-class communities from the shadow of the underworld. When unions like IATSE reasserted internal democracy and transparency, they were not only pushing out corrupt leaders, they were also demonstrating that the rank and file, many of whom were from immigrant backgrounds, could govern their own affairs without help from outside toughs. As the 20th century moved toward its final decades, the Chicago outfit gradually lost some of its earlier influence. Federal prosecutions using RICO, combined with accumulating internal fractures and changing economic conditions, weakened its hold over labor and certain businesses. Other forms of organized criminal activity, drug trafficking cartels, international money laundering schemes, rose to prominence. Yet when policymakers, prosecutors, and historians looked back for models of how organized crime had once embedded itself within American institutions, they continued to find in the Hollywood extortion case, and in the life of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe, a particularly clear and instructive example. By tracing his path from a crowded immigrant tenement to union-linked extortion in Hollywood, from a federal prison cell to a violent death on a Chicago roadside, they could see in one human life the contours of a much larger story. The ways in which criminal organizations exploited the vulnerabilities of a rapidly changing industrial society, and the long, uneven effort by law enforcement, lawmakers, and honest activists to push them back. On a clear morning in contemporary Chicago, the old neighborhoods where Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe once walked feel far removed from his world. Brick two-flats still line narrow streets, corner taverns remain, and church steeples rise above the rooftops, but the mix of languages is wider now. The storefronts advertise different cuisines, and the children playing on the sidewalks have little reason to know the names that once loomed large here. Yet if you look closely, traces of his era still exist. Faded signs over Union halls, buildings that once housed social clubs watched by police, converted theaters that once belonged to circuits touched by the outfit's influence. For historians and curious residents, the path back to Gioe runs not through monuments or plaques, there are none, but through archives. In a quiet reading room, someone requests a box of court transcripts from 1943, the year he and his associates were tried for conspiring to extort Hollywood. The pages arrive, heavy with carbon copies and official stamps. There, in the dry dialogue of direct and cross-examination, his outline takes shape. A defendant seated with Ricca and Campagna, listening as Willie Bioff describes meetings in Chicago hotels, envelopes of cash, and understandings that were never meant to be spoken aloud outside their circle. Elsewhere, microfilmed newspapers crackle with shorter, more sensational glimpses. A 1943 headline announces the Hollywood racket verdicts and lists Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe among the convicted. Another, from August 1954, reports his death in clipped language. Gangster slain, mob figure found shot, labor racketeer killed. A few paragraphs sketch his background, mention his role in the film extortion case, and note that police suspect underworld motives. Then the column moves on. The city, always in motion, had other stories to cover. Law enforcement files, where they have become public through archives or investigative releases, add a different layer. FBI memoranda from the late 1930s and 1940s list him among top hoodlums in Chicago with brief notations. Capone mob associate, linked to IATSE rackets, Hollywood case defendant. Later analytical reports discuss his post-war activities in Cicero and the western suburbs, treat his 1954 murder as an example of internecine gang violence, and in some instances, speculate about its connection to the unresolved tensions surrounding Willie Biafra. The language is technical and restrained, but between the lines, one can sense the frustration of agents who knew that figures like Gioe existed at the center of large, damaging conspiracies, and yet could only rarely pin them down in court. If you follow his story through these fragments, from trial transcript to newspaper clipping to police memo, a composite emerges that is clearer than anecdote but still incomplete. It tells of a man born into an Italian immigrant family on the South Side at the dawn of the 20th century, coming of age amid crowded tenements and limited opportunities. It follows him into the underworld as prohibition turned bootlegging into big business, shows him adapting as the outfit shifted from alcohol to gambling and labor racketeering, and places him in the inner circle of one of the most audacious extortion schemes in American labor history. It records his conviction and imprisonment, his early release, his return to a changed underworld, and his ultimately violent death on a side street, unsolved and officially unexplained. But there are important things this documentary record cannot convey. It does not tell us, for example, how he first felt the pull of underworld life as a young man, whether it seemed a deliberate choice or simply the most obvious route out of the narrow confines of his neighborhood. It does not reveal whether he ever questioned the long-term costs of relying on intimidation and fear to earn a living, or whether he compared his path to that of relatives who stayed in factories or small legitimate businesses. His internal justifications, doubts, and loyalties are largely invisible to us. They exist, if at all, only in the memories of people who are themselves long gone. What the record does show, in stark detail, is how men like Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe helped shape the intersection of crime, labor, and industry in 20th century America. His role in the Hollywood extortion conspiracy was not peripheral. Court evidence and sworn testimony place him as part of the Chicago leadership group that guided the scheme and shared in its proceeds. The conspiracy demonstrated that organized crime could look beyond neighborhood taverns and small local unions to national industries, identifying where the leverage lay and how it could be turned into income. That leverage came, in large part, from the laws and structures that had been built to protect workers' rights. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 gave unions legal recognition and tools to bargain collectively. In most cases, that recognition enabled workers to organize more effectively, secure better wages, and gain some control over the conditions of their work. But in the Hollywood case, the same legal authority, once captured by corrupt leadership and backed by syndicate muscle, became a weapon against both employers and rank-and-file members. Studios paid out vast sums, not to meet negotiated contract demands, but to stave off disruptions orchestrated by officials who answered behind the scenes to men like Ricca, Campagna, and Gioe. For the workers represented by those unions, projectionists, stagehands, set builders, this corruption had real effects. Dues money was misdirected, The integrity of their leadership was compromised, and their union's bargaining power was deployed in ways that served criminal interests rather than collective needs. The scandal, when it broke, undermined public confidence in their union and fueled arguments from critics who claimed that organized labor was inherently susceptible to criminal control. Union reformers spent years countering that narrative, strengthening internal democracy, and demonstrating that the problem lay not in unionism itself, but in the ability of outside actors to capture leadership positions through intimidation, fraud, or bribery. In this sense, the life of Charles Cherry Nose Gioe intersects with the parallel history of labor reform. Every measure enacted in the decades after the Hollywood case, the reporting requirements of Landrum, Griffin, the emphasis on secret ballot elections, the legal protections for whistleblowers, can be read as an attempt to close the openings through which men like him had once entered. When lawmakers cited the IATSE scandal in debates, they were invoking not just a distant criminal case, but a cautionary tale about how quickly a union could be turned against its own members if vigilance lapsed. The same is true in law enforcement. The difficulties prosecutors faced in making charges stick against the Chicago leadership in the Hollywood case, difficulties overcome largely through the risky decision of Biaf and Brown to testify, highlighted the need for tools that could reach higher up the organizational chain. Out of that recognition, decades later came RICO, which allowed the government to treat a pattern of criminal conduct, undertaken by an enterprise over time, as a single, prosecutable whole. Had RICO existed in Gioe's prime, the presentation to a jury might have looked very different. A narrative not only of specific extortion payments, but of a criminal organization that had systematically embedded itself in labor relations across multiple industries. Witness protection, too, carries echoes of his case. The federal witness security program did not yet exist when Biaf cooperated, and while he took steps to conceal his identity in Arizona, his ultimate fate suggested how precarious such self-made arrangements could be. His killing underscored for law enforcement the risks cooperators faced years, even decades, after they testified. The modern program, with its structured relocation, identity changes, and long-term support, reflects lessons learned in part from tragedies like his, tragedies in which former insiders, crucial to exposing schemes that had involved men like Gioe, were later left vulnerable to revenge. Viewed from another angle, the story of Charles Cherry Nose Gioe also raises questions about community and perception. In his early life, he was one of thousands of children in Chicago's Italian neighborhoods, negotiating the difficulties of economic hardship and social stigma. The choices he made connected him to the rising Capone organization and its successors, yet his identity remained, in the public mind, entangled with that of his broader community. For many years, Italian or Sicilian in newspaper crime stories became almost a shorthand for gangster, a distortion that obscured the reality that most Italian-American Chicagoans were not involved in organized crime and bore its costs in the form of discrimination and damaged reputations. Over time, as Italian-American communities diversified economically and professionally, as second and third generations entered universities, professions, and public service, this stereotype weakened. Academic work in sociology and history helped separate cultural identity from criminality, situating figures like Gioe within specific social and economic contexts rather than treating them as representatives of an entire group. Within Italian-American civic organizations, there were conscious efforts to emphasize contributions to labor, business, politics, and the arts that had nothing to do with the underworld. Today, when his name appears in public discussion, it is almost always in specialized contexts. A documentary on the Chicago outfit, a book on Hollywood's labor wars, a scholarly article on the history of labor racketeering. In those settings, he functions less as a character study than as an example, evidence for how a certain kind of organized crime figure operated in the mid-20th century. That relative anonymity in popular culture may, in its own way, be fitting. He did not seek the flamboyant notoriety of an Al Capone. He worked in the middle layers, translating leadership strategy into pressure on the ground, and he paid the price typical for men in that position when internal tides turned. His violent death, unsolved in any formal sense, underlines one of the enduring challenges in documenting organized crime history: the gap between what can be reasonably inferred and what can be legally proved. Investigators who studied his murder were convinced it was an inside job, likely connected either to disputes over labor and gambling rackets or to his dealings with Willie Biaffe. Patterns, timing, and motive all pointed in that direction. Yet without witnesses willing to testify and without surviving documentation of internal decisions, those conclusions remained in the realm of intelligence assessment and historical reconstruction rather than courtroom fact. This limitation is not unique to his case. It is common across the study of clandestine organizations. Much of what is known about the internal logic of the Chicago outfit or similar groups comes from a small number of cooperators, wiretaps installed decades later, and the painstaking synthesis of incomplete records. Within that patchwork, Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe stands as a relatively well-documented figure compared to many of his peers. His federal conviction, his participation in a nationally significant trial, and the public nature of his murder ensured that his name would survive in official paperwork. But there are still large silences, periods of years where the record shows only that he existed and that, according to intelligence summaries, he remained active. In reflecting on his story today, it is tempting to frame it as a straightforward morality tale. A boy from a poor neighborhood seduced by the allure of easy money through crime, rising for a time and then falling violently. There is truth in that outline, but it is too simple. His ascent was not easy. It required navigating dangerous alliances, absorbing the techniques of coercion, and accepting the constant possibility of imprisonment or worse. The money he made came at the cost of harmed businesses, corrupted unions, and communities living under intimidation. His fall, when it came, was not a surprise twist, but the logical endpoint of a life built around an organization that treated people, even long-serving insiders, as expendable when interests demanded it. At the same time, his story is bound up with that of institutions which, in other hands, have been engines for social improvement. Labor unions, when democratic and independent, have helped millions of workers secure better lives. The film industry, for all its excesses and flaws, has contributed immeasurably to cultural life. Immigration, despite the hardships of its first generations, has strengthened and diversified the United States. The fact that someone like Charles Gioe could, for a time, turn the mechanisms of unionism and the economics of Hollywood into tools for extortion does not negate the value of those institutions. It highlights the need for vigilance in protecting them. In the end, the legacy of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe lies less in how he is remembered personally than in the structures and safeguards that arose, in part, in response to the damage men like him inflicted. Stronger union governance, more sophisticated criminal statutes, formal witness protection, and a broader public understanding of organized crimes methods are all pieces of that legacy. So too is a more nuanced view of the immigrant communities from which many early 20th century gangsters emerged, an understanding that distinguishes between the overwhelming majority who pursued stability through lawful work and the small minority who chose a different, more destructive path. Walking again through the neighborhoods where his story began, it is possible to see both continuity and change. Children head to school past the same stoops where, a century ago, other children wrestled with the limits of their prospects. On certain corners, older residents still gather outside social clubs, though the languages they speak may now include Spanish, Polish, Arabic, or Vietnamese. Union banners appear on bulletin boards, advertising meetings and elections. In downtown theaters and on streaming platforms, Films produced under very different labor arrangements flicker to life. Films whose credits reflect a complex global industry no longer susceptible, in quite the same way, to the control of a handful of Chicago racketeers. The life of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe, viewed against this backdrop, becomes one thread in a larger tapestry. The story of how modern America confronted the realities of organized crime, learned from painful episodes of corruption, and reshaped its institutions in response. His rise and fall show how much damage a determined criminal network could inflict when law enforcement was underprepared, and when unions and businesses lacked safeguards. The reforms and legal tools that followed demonstrate that such damage, once recognized, could be limited and, in some respects, undone. The record that preserves his name, indictments, transcripts, memoranda, death reports, is by its nature a record of conflict and harm. It tells us little of kindness, family affection, or private generosity. Those aspects of his life, if they existed, lie beyond historical reach. What it does reveal is the cost of building a career on intimidation and clandestine deals, and the ways in which society, slowly and imperfectly, responded. In that sense, the story of Charles "Cherry Nose" Gioe is not just about a man who moved through the shadows of Chicago's underworld. It is about the long, uneven effort to bring activities like his into the light, to understand them clearly, and to ensure that the institutions he once helped corrupt are stronger and more resilient for those who rely on them today.